glad to have you here this afternoon. My name is Stacy Fox with Cattle Raisers, and we're so glad that you could join us this afternoon as we continue to release some of the programs that would have been presented during our Cattle Raisers Convention and Expo in March that had to be postponed. But we're really glad to have our speakers that are willing to make this pivot to do the online programming. It's not the same for sure as doing them in person, so we really appreciate that they're willing to do this. And during this time, we're working very hard on your behalf. We're continuing with this education content and really glad that we can bring this to you and that you seem to be enjoying it and getting something out of it. So we're going to continue that. And again, glad to have you all join us today. We will have our weekly market update on Friday, so be on the lookout for that, and that way you can get registered there. And with that, I'll go ahead and introduce our speakers. I'm going to keep their introductions short this week. If you've joined us before, you may have heard their stuff, but they're all great partners of TSCRA, and we're so glad to have them here and to take the time and share their knowledge. And these programs with these speakers are always incredibly popular. So we've got Dr. Joe Paschal, who's professor and extension livestock specialist. We've got Dr. Thomas Haregrove, associate professor and extension specialist. And we've got John Grange, who's the Burleson County extension agent, who's actually on the road today doing his work as an extension agent. And we thank them for all the work that they do. But excited for this program. And with that, I will turn it over. Oh, one quick thing. If you have questions, drop those into the question and answer box or the chat box, and we'll get to those at the end and be happy to answer some questions at the end of the program. So drop those in there as we go, and we'll be good to go. Also, you probably won't be seeing a video of me right now. It'll just say TSCRA webinar, but when our other folks start speaking, you should get their feed, but if you're having problems, let us know. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Joe Paschal.
Okay, Doc. Stacy, thank you so very much. Dr. Haregrove, you'll go ahead and put up that first slide. I want to thank Stacy for asking us to do this. It is a lot more fun in person, and Texas and Southwestern Cattle Raisers has a great educational program, so we're glad to still be able to do this. I do need to introduce one additional person. Back up one just a little bit, Doc. Thank you. John Grange. John will be speaking right after me. John is our county extension agent for Ag and Natural Resources at Burleson County in Caldwell, Texas, and actually he was the instrument of an example we're going to talk about later. So Dr. Haregrove and I'm sure John and his colleagues get this question lots of times about, hey, Doc, I had a cow die. What do you think she died from? And so that was sort of the impetus for talking about this. There's a couple of resources that you need to think about or that you need to know about. And we've all had dead livestock, perhaps, or dead cattle, and probably disposed of them in different ways. And so I thought we'd sort of come together and have sort of a concerted effort in what you can and cannot do. There is a really good bulletin at the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. You can reach it as a website. It's called Disposable of Livestock Carcasses. It's a little bit long, a little bit lengthy, but it talks about the do's and don'ts of not only cattle but also small ruminants, horses, and poultry. But the main reason that we dispose of dead livestock, as everybody understands, is protecting public health. Not many diseases can be transmitted from humans to livestock, but they are also a nuisance as well. And we've all seen dead animals on the side of the road, so people stop and look, can cause problems. Prevent the spread of disease, and this is particularly true as we think about some livestock diseases that are reportable, like anthrax, for example. And then, of course, to prevent adverse effects on water quality, animals that die close to water sources, tanks, streams, ponds, near well areas can create adverse effects. Go ahead, Doc. Oops, other way. There we go. So if you have dead animals, I mean, like I said, everybody has come across an animal on their place, most likely, or somebody else's place, or driven by somebody else's place where there's a dead animal. What are the things that you need to think about in terms of figuring out what it is that caused this? And as I said, this comes from 30 plus years of Doc's and mine both, and likely John's, getting this question. So how many animals actually died? So this particular picture is actually some deads from a flood, from a hurricane back in the early part of the 2000s along Galveston. These animals were basically drowned. So how many are out there? Is it just one? Is it a dozen? Are they calves or are they cows? That'll kind of give you an indication of, is it a disease issue or is it parasitism? What is it? Where did death occur? Underneath the tree. So we have a picture that was contributed to by somebody that shows several animals underneath the tree. Obviously, it was a lightning strike. You can look for things like whether or not their hooves were blown off. You know, so we look for those kinds of things. I had a phone call one year from a county agent down in South Texas. The producer called them and said there was a number of dead cattle in his pasture. And he had gone off on vacation for a couple of weeks. And it was gone actually probably a little bit longer than that. And the only source of water for these cattle was a well, an electric well, submersible well. And apparently the electric line went down, the well went down, and the cattle ran out of water, and over a period of probably longer than just a couple of weeks, those cattle expired as a result of not having any water. Were there visible signs of distress? What was the physical appearance of the cattle? Did it look like they struggled? Did it look like they just laid down and died? Those are things that are important. When did death occur? So during the winter time, typically we won't see the decomposition right away, but during the summertime we'll see it very, very quickly. So it's important that if you're going to have your veterinarian involved in helping you understand why these animals died, that we get to these animals as soon as possible. And there's a number of causes down there. There's a number of diseases out there that will kill calves and will kill cows. Most of the time that we get phone calls, a lot of people think about poisonous plants. And we have a number of poisonous plants throughout the state. They vary by region to region. Down in my part of the country, in South Texas, the poisonous plant that seems to be causing major issues or things that are introduced like lantana. And so we do have some poisonous plant issues, but across the state, there are numbers of different plants that cause toxic issues. Fire and flood, lightning, electricity, gunshot. Just right before we were talking with Stacy before the meeting, we're talking about cattle theft. The other thing that's on the rise are cattle killings. I get reports of people shooting cattle. I'm not sure whether they're doing it because they think they might be able to harvest something from them, or they're doing it just out of meanness. But those are things to look for. We already talked about water or lack of, and the other thing that sometimes we forget about is that cows die in calving. There may not be a calf on the ground. The calf may not have actually been able to make it through the birth canal, but those are all things to think about. Go ahead, Doc. So some approved disposal methods, all right? And this is not one of them, but this was a hint in the case that's coming up of how what caused the death of these animals. So there are approved disposal methods by the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. Certain types of landfills in terms of a disaster. So for example, if we have a hurricane or a wildfire, the animals can be disposed in a landfill. Animals can be rendered. There's not very many places that render animals anymore. It used to be there used to be a lot more rendering facilities when I was younger, and much less so now. Incineration, and incineration means that they're actually put into an incinerator and burned completely. Composting, that's very popular in the Panhandle where you have a lot of feeder cattle that may die, And basically what you're doing is you're composting just as if you would leaves in your backyard. Most of us, though, are going to be opting for one of the next three. So burning is acceptable as long as you're not under a burn ban. And so obviously you need to check. And the three types of burning that are allowed or acceptable are open. So, you know, you've just pile material on top of the animal, not railroad ties and not tires. And you might laugh, but we have those questions and we have those issues. A pit, dig a pit and actually burn the animal in the pit, or place the animals in a pyre and burn them with or without accelerants. So you might use diesel or gasoline or even butane or propane to enhance flame. Burial, we'll talk about burial. That's probably probably the best that we can that we should use in terms of disposal. There are some issues with it. And then last is natural decomposition. So on your property, on your place, you can actually allow the animals to decompose. I think there are some caveats. Some people call that abandonment, all right, which means that you're basically abandoning an animal to Mother Nature. Probably not really the best way to dispose of animals. Let's go ahead and go to the next one. So if you're going to bury, and that's how probably I think most of us should look at in terms of burying, in terms of disposal of dead. If you have more than 10 head, you need to contact the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality and the Texas Animal Health Commission, particularly if a veterinarian's not involved, because they need to determine whether or not it's a disease issue or not. Obviously, if it's a lightning strike or a lack of water, but more than 10 head at a time, they need to be contacted. So if you're looking for a site, select a well-drained slope that's not in a floodplain. And there are a couple of recommendations here that are important that sort of vary depending on which form you read. And I've opted for the greater distance. So at least 300 feet from any water source or well. And I've read in places, TCEQ and Animal Health Commission say 200 feet, but 300 feet is better than 200 feet. So that's something to consider. At least 300 feet from any neighboring property line. And so once again, I've seen 200 and 300, so we're going to opt for 300 feet. Select a site that is likely to be undisturbed in the future. Okay, and so realizing that property is going to be developed, but on rangeland and big pastures, find a place that you're not going to be building on. At least 5 feet deep with 3 feet of soil cover. And so most animals, even if after they've started to decompose, are not thicker than about 2.5 feet. And so that you could dig a hole 5 to 6 feet deep and still have plenty of soil cover. And then there's a couple of phone numbers down there to call before you dig. So once you select your site, if you don't know what's under there, there's a couple of numbers there, 1-800 numbers, or you can just simply call 811 and they'll help you determine if there's anything underneath. If the animal died of anthrax, okay, it must be buried within 24 hours. Otherwise, if it just died of normal causes or natural causes, or unnatural causes, I guess I should say, they need to be buried within 3 days. And it's a good thing to note the location of the burial site in case you need to document the death for insurance or disaster program payments. Go ahead. So natural decomposition. So these pictures were taken by me, and they were either taken on my own place or driving up and down the road, or on a site where we were actually looking into individuals. So this is an example of sort of natural decomposition or abandonment. I really don't recommend it. It is something that is done a lot. A lot of times we don't realize the animal has died, and we don't actually find the dead animal until after it's actually been decomposed completely. But this particular animal was actually alongside a U.S. highway and was there for several days, almost a week, before I guess the owner came along and finally drug it off. But I was standing at the fence line when I took that, and it's not a very good picture for folks that are driving up and down the road thinking that we're actually caretakers of livestock. So dead livestock can be allowed to decompose naturally on your property, assuming they did not die of a regulatory disease. You know, make sure that they're not near a roadway or water source, a neighbor's fence line, or anywhere they can be seen by the public. They will attract predators and carrion eaters, and to be honest with you, in this day and time, black-headed vultures are getting to be a tremendous problem. Red-headed vultures that we typically see are buzzards, are true carrion eaters, but black-headed vultures will actually take small animals. And so when cows are getting ready to calve, you'll typically see a lot of black-headed vultures tend to congregate around, and they will actually attack the calf before it's born. So it's another reason not to think about natural decomposition as a primary method of livestock disposal. And it is not an acceptable practice in some states. It is in Texas, but not in other states. Next. So at this point, what we're going to do is we're going to allow Dr. Haregrove and John to talk about what transpired and sort of talk about how when we were called out to a particular, I had some cows die, what's going on. So Dr. Haregrove or John, I'm going to let y'all carry on from here, and I'll jump in at time from time.
John, why don't you give just a little bit of description?
Okay. So we had a producer, one of my producers, he's an older producer, has been in the cattle business for years and years. He contacted our veterinarian locally there in Caldwell, Texas, and come to find out he had an issue with some cattle dying. And so the veterinarian started looking into it and couldn't figure out what was going on. The more we dove into it, we come to find out he ended up having about 20 animals die in 2019. And everything that the veterinarian could do, she couldn't figure out, all tests were coming back negative, and she just couldn't pinpoint it on any one thing. So from there, they actually went and contacted our media relations with A&M, and then it kind of got to Dr. Haregrove and Dr. Pascal, and then to me. And so as a joint effort, one of the concerns was toxic plants. We went and we looked at the plants in this pasture, and you really didn't see anything that you didn't see in anybody else's pasture. And as we dug into it more and more, and we found out, 20 animals have died in 1 year, we knew it had to be more than that. So we pulled samples throughout the hay pasture. We did samples on all the hay baled that they've been feeding, and we did samples of their water in their ponds and in their creek. So we wanted to get a good sample of everything. So Dr. Haregrove, in conjunction with Dr. Haregrove and Dr. Pascal, Dr. Haregrove, he'll talk about that because he sent those off to have tested. And, that kind of sums up this guy. He did vaccinate for blackleg as they were born. As far as I know, he did have a worming schedule. The only extra feed that he really did out there besides hay and maybe some cubes was some.
Hello?
We may have lost John, Doc. Why don't you take over?
So basically, I think John's covered. Go ahead. I'm sorry, John.
The old trace mineral blocks and the salt blocks. And every time we looked at those didn't seem very, very well touched. So, so that kind of sums up that case. And two is that it showed the importance of our relationship with the producer and then relationship with our special. Okay, Doc.
Okay? So the history continues, and I think John's covered most of this. Mineral supplementation was white salt, yellow salt, and trace mineral block. And again, vaccination history, basically blackleg to the calves. Bermuda grass pasture, they did harvest hay from the pasture for supplementation. They had 3 water sources. They had pond water. They had a dry creek that would come up after it rained, and then well water. And well water was the principal. The cows kind of like the well water post, so they traveled a long way to get to the well. So there was oil production on the property, and did not observe any biosecurity issues with neighbors. In other words, fences were in pretty good shape. We didn't see any issues where maybe, had issues with neighbors. A few actual deaths were actually observed. Usually what they found was just a carcass. But the veterinarian came out and met with Dr. Pascal and I, and we kind of walked some pastures and talked a good bit, and kind of what she was describing and what the owner was describing sounded more like an incoordination collapse. Then they talked about one cow that was actually carried to the auction market, got down in the trailer. So that kind of got us to thinking a little bit about transport technique. But again, one of the things that everybody was kind of concerned about was the toxic weeds. Generally, cattle were in body condition for about 4.5. Calves appeared healthy. And again, they were grazing Bermuda grass. They were supplemented with a cube in the winter. Okay. So basically, they said they had lost about 20 cows. One of the individuals did have kind of a little bit more detail of when they had found dead cows. Now, to do the math, there's only 14 there. All the calves except the one that died there in June with its mother, all the rest of the cows were up close to wean. But mostly dead cows, and they seemed to kind of die in little groups. So that was kind of one key. So we walked the pastures out. Joe, why don't you talk a little bit about the toxic plants we found and why we kind of didn't get too excited. Joe?
I'm sorry, I was muted. I apologize. They're doing some work. They're doing some work outside my office and a lot of banging. So these are the 2 toxic weeds that we would normally see in that part of the country. There may be some others, but these would be the 2 principal ones. Coffee senna, so the bean pods and the whole plant actually is toxic. But we didn't see any, and typically we see these around ponds. There is another senna bean that looks very similar, but you can actually look at the pods and tell the difference. Animals will eat it when there's nothing else to eat. There was plenty of green stuff in these pastures for these animals to eat, even though I believe it was October. We really hadn't had a freeze, and the cattle were in good condition. Then the other thing that we did see some, and we saw it not necessarily scattered throughout the pasture, but in some low-lying areas and up on the hill, it was silverleaf nightshade. So nightshade is a toxic plant. The most toxic part are the berries. They look like little tomatoes. They're about the size of a large pea. And when they turn yellow in the fall. Sometimes confused with croton or doveweed, except that doveweed is not toxic. And then the berries, the color of the berries and the colors of the flowers give it away. The berries are very, very toxic. Lots of times we'll see browsing on the plant, and we actually did see some plants that had been grazed. But once again, with both of these plants, the dose is in the poison. And so 95% of their intake was provided by forage, and 5% or less was provided by toxic weeds. The dilution factor, keeps them from being poisoned. I doubt if they ate even that much because there there was no Centibene that I recall seeing in there, Don or Doc or John. And the Silverleaf Nightshade was just in one or two little areas.
Okay. So after visiting with the veterinarian, visiting with the owner, like I said, most of them they just found dead, but the few that they did see, kind of what they was describing sounded a lot like grass staggers. So problem with grass staggers, we usually think about that as tied to a magnesium deficiency, grass staggers or grass tetany. Okay, so the problem is magnesium is often involved, but it's a very complex type of metabolic disease, and it can be in where you have a real plush forage like wheat. You'll see that a lot on cows on wheat pasture, heifers on wheat pasture. You'll see it a lot of times also when they have a very low quality forage. Okay, so magnesium is not stored in the liver, or it's stored in the liver, but it's not available out of the liver. So they must continually ingest it and absorb it in the forestomach or the rumen, right? And then it's used immediately, so there's just not a storage mechanism in cattle. Low energy negatively affects absorption. So if you've got a low energy diet, then you're not going to absorb as much magnesium. By the converse, like we was talking about, wheat pasture, some of these lush grasses, if we don't have the energy, but we have a high protein is going to cause ammonia to be built up in the rumen, which negatively affects the absorption, right? Because it's absorbed through when it's actually transported through the rumen wall. High potassium negatively affects the absorption. In fact, that's one of the big issues you see with wheat pasture. And then low sodium, because the sodium is necessary again for the transport mechanism through the rumen wall. So one of the things that's real important is these ratios. So the sodium potassium ratio is important. Ideally, we want it to be about 5 to 1. In other words, we want a lot more sodium than we have potassium. If we get down to about 3 to 1, then we're more likely to see problems. Okay, so we kind of put together a little plan to how we want to investigate that. So like John said, first thing was soil samples, and then we took forage samples. We took hay. They had some hay that they were using, last year's hay, and then some new hay. So we sampled all their hay, and then we sampled the standing forage. And then we sampled water from each of the sources. Then we took samples from the animals. Okay, so this is, and the soil samples, there was 3 different pastures. So I just took, they all were very, very similar. But looking at the soil sample here, there's a first tip off is you've got a very low sodium. So I guess one of the questions, and I'd throw that back to Dr. Pascal, is the importance of soil sampling. Because I think, again, as we go through this was quite an expensive workup with the animals and stuff like that, but 20 cows are pretty expensive too. But going back and start looking at our soil, looking at our forage, could have avoided some of these problems. So Joe, if you don't mind, you might talk just a little bit about how often do I need to test my soil? What's the importance of it?
You bet, Doc. So, we were all really surprised at the low level of sodium that we saw in the soil sample, because whatever the animals eat, whatever the animals are grazing, unless you're applying it in a fertilizer, they're getting it out of the soil. And it was sort of interesting that there were so many other good things in this soil except sodium. And so sodium is used for ion transport. We don't think about that, but we think about in terms of humans, so high sodium diets cause high blood pressure. Well, they also cause muscles to be able to contract, part of the ion transport system. And so this really, really low level, I think a lot of people still realize the importance of having a good white salt. I know that we had sulfur salt block and we had mineral salt out, but a good white salt block. Cattle have an actual requirement for salt. and they'll consume up to about almost 1/10 of a pound of salt per 100 pounds of body weight. They don't need that much, but they actually, should have salt. So a good soil sample like we saw right here, we don't think about taking samples in pastures. And by the way, even the soils lab reminded us that we're supposed to take a soil sample should only represent about a 40-acre plot. And so, if you've got a 100-acre pasture, you really ought to be submitting at least 2 soil samples. But, I try to do a soil sample on my pastures at least every other year. And I realize that's sort of an expense and it's time consuming. But my hay fields, I certainly do a soil sample every year. Because if I'm going to put out fertilizer, I want to make sure I put out exactly what I'm going to need. But I'll even fertilize my grazing pastures. And so it's important, I think, to get a soil sample on those. Now, in this particular case, we're not using it for fertilizer. We're actually trying to determine if we have a shortage. And as I said, this was really interesting because of that really low level of sodium that we saw. And we were thinking it might be some other things, but certainly sodium was suddenly came way high on the radar screen. Doc?
So then the next thing is we set forage, we standing forage, and then the older hay from last year, and then the new hay. So we sent that all off and had it analyzed. There's 2 things that jump out. We're going to talk a lot about the other things in this analysis first, but the first things that really jump out at me is the crude protein and the TDN. And so what did we talk about earlier? If you had low energy, you was going to have issues absorbing magnesium. Again, we certainly don't have issues with protein, but they were supplementing some in the winter. So again, we're going to talk a lot more about these different minerals as we go on. But looking at the soil sample and then just looking at protein and TDN on that forage analysis starts to send up a flag. Joe, you have any other comments there?
No, I agree. And we're using a forage analysis in this particular to sort of look at, what's the diet interaction. It's not that crude protein or TDN is going to cause them to die or only the lack of it, but these cattle were in good body condition. So if you look further down there in some of the in terms of the mineral, both macro and micronutrients, that's important to have. So many of us do not supplement cattle with minerals. We think that it's an expense, and I'm not talking about the trace mineral block that you buy for $7 or $8. I'm talking about a good trace mineral. If you're expecting good performance out of your cattle, it's a must. But in this particular example, it showed that just keeping the cattle alive, it would be a good idea to have a good trace mineral out there. Go ahead, Doc.
So what we're looking at here, and I want to thank Dr. Aaron Norris, who was a grad student here at the time. He's gone off to Nevada, now University of Nevada. But basically, what we see to the right of the screen is the mineral requirements of a lactating and a pregnant cow. And then we see what our levels were. So our magnesium was low in the forage and the old hay, and it wasn't particularly high in the new hay. For lactation, we need about 0.2%. See, so magnesium kind of threw a little flag right there. And then again, our potassium, we only need 70, so our potassium's a little bit elevated again. And so then our iron's a little elevated. The other thing that, and we'll look at this here in a little bit with some other stuff, when we look at the animals' results, but look at the copper levels. The copper in this animal, in these forages, was all low. In other words, we need about 10%, and the highest we have is, well, we have 8%. But again, all of those factors kind of throw us back. Yeah, we have some issues with our forage. Okay, and so then we did water analysis. Now again, we analyzed all the water sources. We analyzed all the pastures. So, and I just made one slide of each, but they're all very similar. So you can see in the water, there's not any real issues in the water sample. This water was acceptable. We didn't see any real issues there.
Doc?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, so two things. One is both in the previous slide and in this slide, you know, if you go and look, you know, we're not all these minerals. You have a slide later on that shows interrelationships. So all these minerals that we're looking at, starting underneath chlorine, the Cl, the Fe, iron, Zn, zinc, Cu, copper, Mn, manganese, Mo, molybdenum. Those are all catalysts. They cause reactions for hormones and enzymes in the animal. And when one of them gets out of whack, that means that particular pathway, that particular enzyme doesn't function or isn't produced. And so whatever it controlled, it goes haywire. And so that's why it's important to sort of look at some of this and relate it back to what does the animal actually need. And then your water sample, I guess that's what the next one is, Doc. If you look there at the sodium, you know, you'll look there and it says, yeah, it's acceptable, but it's just barely acceptable. So even in the water's not even salty, even though because it from runoff, whether it was well water or tank water, there wasn't anything there to pick up. Right.
This was the well, but they were all very similar.
Okay.
Okay, so the next thing we decided we needed to do was sample some cows. So basically what we did was we took blood samples out of the cows. We also took urine samples out of the cows. So we pulled randomly 10 cows out of the herd. They had the cows up, and we just basically the first 10 that we got into the run that we could work with. Okay. And so these are the results of the blood samples. Here's where it starts to get, to me, real important. I just sent this sample to the diagnostic lab. What's my take-home message here? Iron, all the irons are high, right? In all of the blood samples. So Joe, could you go back a little bit? What's the importance of that iron?
So where are we at, Doc? I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. We're looking at the blood samples on the cows.
Oh yeah, yep. Also on the iron.
Uh-huh.
So I mean, those are way over the top as we look at them, and particularly we start looking at some of these that are like 1,300. I forget. Don't recall what the average was, but certainly well over the 500.
Right.
Now there's a lot of iron in the soil, but iron does tie up a lot of other non-metallic ions, and of course, you know, things like chlorine and others that are important for, again, muscle function, for enzymes, for things like that.
And then looking just left to the iron is the copper, and then that's one of the big tie-ups with sulfur and iron are one of the things that bind copper. So you might have adequate copper, but if you've got a lot of sulfur in your water source, like Jiffy water, whatever, you got a lot of iron, sometimes that's going to bind the absorption of that copper.
Yep.
So the red means they were deficient. So if you look there, out of the 10 cows, we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 of those cows that are below normal. And some of them, you know, are significantly below normal. Okay, now the next thing to look at, if I just sent a serum sample in and looked at these, and this is what this was collected with serum, was look at the serum selenium. So I've only got one that's kind of marginal there. But what does selenium tell me in the serum? It just tells me that that's a one-shot. That's what's happening right now at this minute. Blood selenium, whole blood selenium is going to be a much better indicator of the selenium status. So if you'll notice, we're not real deficient in selenium, but selenium, all of those reds are below normal. So, you know, again, these cattle, I'm not saying they had a real bad selenium deficiency, but I do believe that's something that needs to be addressed. Mm-hmm. Now, if we go over and we look at the magnesium, that's serum magnesium. And if you'll notice, all of those magnesiums were normal. So if I took that blood test and I set it off, took that back and I looked at my results, probably the first thing that I would do was maybe go back without thinking about this a lot. So I'm gonna add some more copper to a mineral, right? And if I just looked at serum seleniums, I'm probably not gonna be too terrible excited. And what am I gonna do about my iron? That's gonna be, that's more of a source, so there's not a lot we can do to control that except kick up the things where it's antagonistic to, like copper. Joe, any comments on that?
No, that's good, Doc. Yeah.
Okay. So we go back and, okay, so we've looked at this. So this, we just got our lab sample and we looked at it and we said, what are we going to do with those cows? We'd say, we got an obvious copper deficiency, right? That's pretty much where we'd go. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about magnesium. Okay, so what did we say a while ago? There's a lot of things that affects the absorption of magnesium, and magnesium has to continually be absorbed. Okay, now if you notice our levels that we pulled at that point in time were all pretty normal. But the best way to tell what the magnesium level is, in other words, are you getting, and again, this gets a little bit more complicated, but you do a urine magnesium to a urine creatinine ratio, right? And that's called the corrected urinary magnesium concentration. The reason this is important, and again, we're not trying to get complicated, the reason this is important is because you want to know how much magnesium they're secreting all along. This formula kind of corrects for that. Because if I went out and took a urine sample now, took a urine sample in 3 hours, took another urine sample in 3 hours, my levels might be somewhat different. This is kind of giving me my steady state or what my magnesium, in other words, how much magnesium is being passed on through the urine, because again, any excess magnesium is not stored, it's passed on out through the urine. Joe, any comments there?
No, that's right.
Okay, so what you do is that's called the creatinine to magnesium ratio, and then so let's look at what we've got now. So we've got our low seleniums in our blood, but then look when we did the ratio, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 of those cows. 7 of those cows that definitely are having issues with absorbing magnesium. Okay, and the other cows, so down at the very bottom, you'll see over 1. We want that magnesium to creatinine ratio to be at least over 1, and we're not, see, we've got 2 of those that are barely over 1. So again, that starts to tell me that, yeah, magnesium, we need to address the magnesium, and what's more importantly, the things that's causing the magnesium not to be absorbed. So again, we just compared the seleniums trying to see if there was a tie back to magnesium selenium. So the take-home message is grass tetany, grass staggers, lactation technique, wheat pasture poisoning. All of these are related to mineral problems associated with magnesium. And so if I'm talking to somebody in some parts of the state, when they talk about grass tetany, they're usually talking more about, okay, we're on a pasture, things weren't so good, or we're on a poor quality hay. I practiced a long time in the rolling plains. When I think about grass tetany, usually I think more about wheat pasture poisoning. So again, all of these different factors can affect magnesium, but it's not just a simple that I need to replace the magnesium. Everybody's probably tried to put out high mag minerals, especially on wheat pasture, so we could stop wheat pasture poisoning some of these heifers and older cows. Does it work? Sometimes it helps, but the real issue is magnesium is not particularly palatable, so cows don't like to eat a lot of magnesium. It kind of turns them off. So the other things that, again, usually wheat's going to be very high in potassium. All the other things that go together. So grass tetany, you'll see it on lush pastures, poor quality hay. You can see it through a lot of scenarios, because I know in talking to some producers, well, it couldn't be grass tetany because we don't have a lush pasture. or the other way around. Okay. So again, like Joe spoke of a while ago, minerals are complex, and very rarely is it just one mineral involved. They all are kind of absorbed together, or they act on each other. So my take-home message with this is spend a lot of time with your veterinarian developing a herd plan, but include metabolic diseases, not just a vaccination protocol. I think all those things are important. Don't misunderstand this. But this issue here, if we really trying to control metabolic diseases, just going in and doing some simple things like analyzing your forage, because it's not going to be the same every year. And people are always saying, well, my hay is X protein or whatever. Very rarely when you submit it and you look at it, it's usually not as good as you think it is. So. I don't know what I did.
Still there?
Yeah, I had a little deal came up with it.
Okay. All right, Doc, we got a couple of questions. Are you there? Doc, did I lose you?
I think we did lose him.
I think we did lose him. Okay, so maybe he'll be back. Okay, so Stacy had some questions, and I answered them on the chat, but and just in case Doc actually comes back. So one of the questions was, in case everybody didn't get to read the chat, because I know some folks might be listening on another device, that I had said something about black-headed buzzards, and they're with hawks and owls, the buzzards, and we're not allowed. They're migratory species, and we're not allowed to kill them. Okay, or actually, we're not even allowed to disturb their nest, and they have become a bigger problem. I never used to see them. I'm based in Corpus Christi. I run a lot in South Texas, but I go up almost to College Station and over towards Houston, and that's typically where I see them north and east of Victoria. Maybe y'all see them in the Edwards Plateau and further north. But they are predators, okay? They're not just carrion eaters. But because they are protected by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, you're not supposed to kill them. You're not even supposed to disturb them, or unless, of course, they're attacking your livestock. But you need to visit with the local animal damage control person in your county or in your region, or visit with your Texas game warden and find out what lethal or non-lethal control methods you can use, because they are getting to be a problem. And one of the interesting things, the experts, the wildlife experts, and I'm not one of those guys, is that the widespread erection of cell phone towers has increased their distribution, because those are ideal habitat for buzzards to look for prey. Another question was, somebody asked about they'd lost 2 cows in 2 separate pastures. One may have died on calving, one was dead on a bare hill. So it may have been struck by lightning, very, very possible. Typically when animals are struck by lightning, depending on, where, if they were actually struck or it was through a tree, you'll see things like maybe their hooves or their horns will be exploded away from their body. Not very far, but it'll just look like they've been blown off just a little bit. They've been separated. And we really recommend that if you want that you work with your veterinarian to develop a herd health program. And to me, that's money well spent. I mean, I'm not a veterinarian. Dr. Haregrove is a veterinarian, but both John and I will agree that veterinarians see a lot more folks, see a lot more cattle, know a lot more issues, and just sitting down, bring a box of donuts and a cup of coffee and develop a herd health plan that's for diseases, for parasites, and as Doc said, for possible metabolic issues, poisonous plants. and get it all done at once. Another question that we had was about mowing, nightshade, silverleaf nightshade, and it really sort of depends on when you mow the stuff. If you mow it after it's almost, after the berries are out there, well, then the berries are going to be on the ground. You almost have to mow it before the berries are formed, right about the time that it starts to bloom, to have any impact. But of course, there's seeds in the soil. It's a phototropic plant, so as soon as you get disturbance in the soil, those plants are going to come up. It's really best to spray them. There's a number of really good products that are out there. Visit with your local county extension agent. They can tell you what to spray, when to spray. Spray them when they're roughly 2 to 4 inches. That way you don't have to use as much product. But because they're very hairy, we do recommend that you use what's called a surfactant or a soap, so that the herbicide actually attached to the plant. Another question was, are there ways to improve water quality if anything's out of whack? And unfortunately not. There's not. The amount of water that cattle drink, cattle drink approximately a gallon per 100 pounds of body weight every day. Unless it's hot or they're lactating, then it's double that. And so there's probably not a way really to improve your water supply unless you're going to drill a new well. But then that's where a good mineral comes in. Find out what's in your water, what's in your soil, what's in your pasture, and then figure out what you can fix with your mineral. And then finally, Doc, there's a question for you, and the question was about multi-min. So if they have a problem with wheat pasture poison, is multi-min 90 good for prevention of magnesium issues?
Okay, can you hear me all right?
Yes, sir.
Okay, good deal. Well, Multimin, and I have no issue with Multimin. I think as just like everything else, I think it needs to be used judiciously. Okay, I'll leave that there. But you're not gonna take care of all their mineral problems with the needle. So if you're on wheat pasture poison, are you going to be able to inject Multimin and take care of grass tetany? The answer is no, because again, we talked about how important it was that magnesium has to be absorbed in the rumen. So they have to have a continuous diet of magnesium. Now again, Multimin sometimes, if you have real issues with immune function, and you can just demonstrate that you have real low coppers, real low zinc, sometimes that'll kind of help boost those things up. So I'm not saying Multimin doesn't have a place, but I think you need to, it's going to be a lot smarter and a lot easier if we can adjust our minerals kind of going off what are they eating, what are they drinking. Dr. Gill, and I got in just a little bit at the end, and I apologize for all the mess we had here, but I know we did a deal in the Rolling Plains back about 15 years ago, and we looked at about 9 ranches that went from up in Shackelford County all the way up to the Oklahoma line. And what we saw was, and they were all in a good mineral program, and we looked at that over a 2-year period. But where we saw a lot of the issues with copper and stuff, they would be on the forage was fairly similar. And their mineral was fairly similar, but the water. So a lot of those places as you're going north have a lot of well water. It's pretty jippy. And then again, iron a lot of times will be a big factor. A lot of iron in the water, a lot of sulfates in the water usually goes with that jippy water. So always, always, always analyze that water too. And then sometimes that water will change a little bit from year to year, even tank water, because in the bottom of those ponds, sometimes there's a spring when things change. Sometimes that water will fluctuate somewhat. So again, mineral supplements, you need to know what's in the forage. You need to know what they're consuming, but also the antagonists in the water, in my opinion, are very, very important.
Doc, 2 more questions. Is grass tetany seen in stocker cattle or primarily cows? And then the second question is, are there any typical signs that livestock are mineral deficient?
Okay, that's a good question. So grass tetany, usually grass tetany, even in wheat pasture, is associated more with with heifers, usually as they're getting close to parturition, close to calving. But that doesn't, and if you'll notice in this sample we had today, this case we talked about today, they also lost some heavier calves. Now, lighter calves, and as the calf matures, they can actually reclaim magnesium back from their bone, right? But as they mature into ruminants, as they mature along, then they can't access that magnesium from the bone like a calf can. But in this situation, the case we talked about today in Burleson County, they actually had some, and we questioned them a lot about that, was what size of the calf. So the one calf that, if you notice, the cow died and the calf died, well, they died at the same time. So that cow was obviously affected at parturition. All those things kind of went together. All the other calves were big calves getting close to weaning is my understanding and visiting with the owners.
And then what are some typical signs that livestock might be mineral deficient?
Okay, and so I apologize on my slides. So one of them, I had a picture of some, so copper. So the things we think about copper, we think about hair color changing and stuff like that, right? We think as it progresses along, we start to get bigger joints. We start to see a lot of other issues, but there's other things that can cause hair change too, right? And so again, I think the best thing is anytime you're looking at minerals and you're trying to sample out of a herd, don't just sample one cow. And I've made this mistake in practice and people all the time, right? So a calf dies or a cow dies, I cut a piece of liver off, I want to go back and I want to see what's the mineral status. Okay, see these calves right here that we just put up. Okay, now those, when I was in practice, and a lot of people say, well, those were Angus calves. Well, they're just losing their hair. I would not disagree. I can tell you that these pictures were actually that ranch did. They sent them to some nutritionists and in academia, and the deal was these are obviously copper deficient animals. Well, we had good forage analysis on this ranch, and they were on a good program, and so we went back and actually performed biopsies on a bunch of those calves that morning. They all come back pretty close. The copper wasn't the issue. So again, we do think about color changes. We do think about big joints. You can, what else ties up copper? Molybdenum. So if you've got a lot of molybdenum, that can actually affect reproduction. Copper by itself doesn't affect reproduction usually as much as the antagonist tied to it.
Let's see, Doc, I don't know that we had, see if we have any more questions. Oh, okay. Is there any supplement or treatment that will help with arthritis in older cows?
Okay. That's a good question. And as far as if it's sure enough just arthritis, a lot of times that's just like people, that's part of the aging process, right? And so there's not much that's going to really have an effect. Now, again, what's the cause of the arthritis? And you have to go back there. You have to kind of dig a little deeper, kind of like with this herd. So is it conformation, stuff like that? So you can start getting arthritis in animals. Is it actually nutritional? There's diseases that can cause arthritis, right? So mycoplasma, certainly Histophilus. There's other things that can affect the joints. So again, as far as any magic, what's the age of cow? What's the circumstances? There's a lot of things that could go back to the arthritis.
Okay. Anybody else? Good questions. Really good questions. Well, Stacy, I believe we're at the end. We're pretty close. If you, we're going to turn it back over to you.
Oh, well, perfect. Thank you so much to our speakers for their work today and taking the time to do this and be part of our meeting today and all TSCR events. You're both very, and John as well for the work that he does with us his perspective. So thank you all. We will have our weekly market update on Friday at 2 p.m. We're going to have Dr. David Anderson again. So be on the lookout and come get registered for that. And we did record this session, so you will be sent an email tomorrow with the copy of the recording. And so we'll be on the lookout for that tomorrow. And then if you have any questions or need anything, please don't hesitate to reach out to TSCRA. And we're so thankful that you were all able to be on today. And with that, we'll call it a end to this webinar, and we'll see you next time. Thanks, everyone.